Hello, I'm Janine Cox, and I'm a compassionate care volunteer in Campbell River at Hospice. And I'm sitting down today with Lisa Fawkes, who is a community advocate for mental health and a community member. So
Yes.
Thank you for being here. And Louise Daviduck, who is Executive Director of Hospice and really has her finger on the pulse of what's currently going on in Campbell River around mental health and hospice. So thank you for being here. I wanted to start with you, Lisa, and ask you a little bit about how you first came to hospice for care.
My journey to hospice was because of the most difficult period of my life. My husband declined in a mental health capacity over a 7-month period. He went from being a very healthy, loving, caring man to being a person who was very fearful, couldn't sleep, dealt with a lot of anxiety issues. By the end, he was dealing with psychosis and delusions, and he dragged my sons and I along with him on that path. And it ended up with him committing suicide in front of me trying to stop him on October 10th, 2020, which ironically was World Mental Health Day. So after that happened, I knew my sons and I were in trouble. It was a very difficult period of time with my husband, and then his suicide was another horrific layer on top of it. It was like our world had exploded. And I knew I needed help. I knew I could not sort my emotions and make sense of what had happened without help. So I asked several friends. I have some friends who are counselors in high schools in the community. They recommended hospice as well. Glenn's GP called me and asked what he could do, and I said, I need counseling help for my sons and myself. I need you to recommend somewhere, and he recommended hospice as well. So I contacted hospice. At the time, my youngest son didn't feel he needed help, and I knew enough to know he had to be in the right place before getting counseling. He did eventually go for counseling. So, and knowing how difficult it was to find help for my husband, and watching that slide from being, my husband was a helicopter pilot. He was no issues with drug abuse, alcoholism, very healthy and fit. We did everything we could as a family, a couple. We ran, we hiked, we did weights, he meditated. We got a counselor. He was doing a cognitive behavioral therapy course online. And of course, this was all during COVID, which complicated things. And it got to the point in the summer where I knew he really needed help. And when I went to mental health and substance abuse here in Campbell River, I was told he had to self-refer. At that point, he was very, very paranoid. And the other complicating factor was he would not allow me to talk to anybody about what he was dealing with. He monitored my phone, my iPad. He didn't want anybody to know what he was going through. He felt a lot of shame around what he was going through. So it took a while before I was able to get family involvement and family help. And when I did, all of us tried to find something else for Glenn above and beyond what we were doing because it wasn't working. And he ended up in emergency 4 times. He phoned the crisis line several times. I was with him before he did commit suicide, twice before, where he stood on a cliff and I knew he was thinking of jumping. And it took me an hour to talk him off of there. And I just really felt unheard, dismissed, and powerless. And so to find hospice, phone them up and say, I need counseling for my family. And it was easy. It was compassionate, it was professional, it was caring. And it kind of restored my faith that there are supports, because I really felt there were none after what we went through. Even though my husband did end up in psych emergency services in Victoria, he was discharged with no plan, as far as I could tell. He had, over the course of his illness, he was probably referred to a psychiatrist 4 times. We never knew what happened to those referrals. When we phoned mental health and substance abuse, they told us the day before Glenn committed suicide, they told us he wasn't on the referral list. And the list was 6 months long.
Do you have the sense, Lisa, that that is because of the capacity of the system, or they couldn't understand or diagnose what was going on for Glenn?
It was probably both.
Okay.
When he went into his appointments, he was extremely upset before every appointment, and he was going to the doctor 2 to 3 times a month, and he was on medications for his insomnia and his anxiety. And he was extremely upset before counseling sessions. He didn't want people to know how bad it was. So he admitted to his insomnia and his anxiety, but he did not admit, and he admitted paranoia. He didn't admit that he had delusions. He didn't admit that he had psychosis. He was sure the police were after him and they were going to lock him up forever.
I think one of the reasons these conversations are so important is because I'm guessing some of that for him was shame, that he just couldn't look at how deep that was for him. And I think that's why we need to talk about it so much more and say these things out loud and hear it. And did your family have any experience with mental health before this?
I was shocked.
I bet.
As you can tell, I look like I'm in chemotherapy treatment. I'm not. I have alopecia, but I have had cancer twice. My husband had cancer.
Okay.
So I'm not unfamiliar with how our healthcare system works. I was shocked at how the mental health care system works.
Yeah.
It does not work the same way.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emphasis put on the person who is mentally ill. My husband was not thinking clearly. He could suck it up and go into appointments and be in psych emergency.
Yeah.
And because he was well groomed and he was a good looking man and he was polite and he did what he was told, our concerns, we sent in a document with Glenn because we knew during COVID we were not allowed in with him.
Right.
In fact, my son was threatened with security at Royal Jubilee because he insisted that he was going to go in with his dad. I was not there at the time. My in-laws were giving me a break. They knew I needed some respite. I needed some help. Glenn was waking me up every night. I was sleep deprived. My whole life was around supporting this man and trying to keep him safe.
Yeah.
And that was all I did. So I would have these breaks and I would try and find help for my husband. I was trying to contact friends who worked in the field. Where do I go? How do I get him this next level of care? So when he went into psych emergency services, I felt relief that he was going to get the help he needed.
Yeah.
I asked a doctor to talk to me. No doctor ever contacted me. I phoned and directly asked to speak to a doctor. I was stonewalled. I was told my husband was safe, and that was all I was told. So psych emergency services was very problematic. We as a family tried to have the government look at what was happening there. We had a petition that was sent before the legislature. The thing that really, really stuck out for me was when I got Glenn's medical records, the psychiatrist that saw him while he was there told him to take back autonomy from his family and that he was in charge of his own safety. Well, 19 days later, he took control and he jumped off a bridge. So for me, there's a lot of problems there. And as we dug deeper, we came to realize there's real problems with the Mental Health Act.
Yeah.
And that has spurred on my advocacy, which I could not have ever done without the support of hospice. Because hospice allowed me to navigate everything that I had just been through and to somewhat come back to myself and give me the tools to move forward.
Lisa, did you feel that your husband's mental health issues escalated during COVID, maybe because of COVID, or do you feel it was starting to happen before that? Because I know for us at hospice that since COVID, we've seen a great increase in traumatic situations. And do you know about
There
where it
were,
was?
in January of 2020, there were a lot of stressors for Glenn. We had a top of a tree hit our house, so damaged our roof. So then we were in renovations for several months, which Glenn found really stressful. We had a son who had traveled down to New Zealand. When the world shut down in February, we had to try and figure out how to bring him back. That was extremely stressful for Glenn. I got very, very ill end of February, March for about 6 weeks. I suspect it was COVID. I didn't get out of bed for weeks. That was stressful for Glenn. Glenn was working on, he had our control of our finances. He lost a significant amount of money because of the stock market crash during COVID. That was another stressor for him. So COVID was in the background during all of it. COVID was also in the background for us trying to get help for him, for sure. Yeah.
And I'm assuming this sounds very familiar to you, Louise, because you are, you know exactly what's going on with. So tell us a little bit of what hospice is seeing and the changes over the last few years to your.
Well,
referrals.
it's interesting because before COVID, we were already at our max of services. And we work really hard at the Hospice Society to make sure that we don't have too long of wait lists because, of course, nobody should be waiting when they're needing to deal with grief. But since COVID started to happen, we saw now an increase of 81% requests for support since we were at the max already before. So you can imagine what that put us through, and it was very difficult to navigate. Luckily, virtual counseling was something that we could work with. So we were able to hire a couple of counselors, which was a scary situation for us when before we were dealing with just one. So it really impact how we have to fundraise and make sure that we have the funds long term for the counselors that we needed. In the past, we relied more on volunteers. We trained volunteers. They helped us with clients who were not as impacted with their grief. So they could help bridge that. But since 81% of the increase were traumatic deaths, that changed everything we were doing.
So much more complicated.
It was very complicated, and that's where it came into play that we had to have professional clinical counselors to help manage these traumatic experiences that people had.
Can you talk a little bit about age and what we're looking at hospice in terms of, traditionally a hospice is and now what we're looking at in our community?
Yeah, again, since COVID, our request for support for children has really increased.
Yeah.
So I think we're sitting at about 17% of our clientele are children. And we do have art therapy. And art therapy is a piece of the therapy. And it's for adults as well, but it works really well with kids.
Yeah.
And we have art and play therapy. But that's only 2 days a week. And what we're looking at is building a full, robust program for youth and children that they can go through for a proper amount of time so that they can really get under their so they can really deal with the traumatic death or grief that they're dealing with. Because now the amount of suicides and drug overdoses is something we have never seen before at hospice. And I know a lot of people don't realize that hospice supports people who are grieving, but it's a huge amount of what we do.
Yes.
And an example is in one day, we got 4 separate phone calls of 4 separate suicides in Campbell River. And that is, I don't think people realize what is really happening. And it's the regular people.
It's our neighbors. It's our community.
It's our neighbors. And so it's impacting hospice in a way that we're holding up this end of the whole balance of everything that is going on and all the after effects of COVID. But I see it as being proactive as well, because the stats say that if a child suicides, it impacts the rest of the siblings by 50% chance of them suiciding themselves. So it's a cycle, and the cycle has to stop. And the way to stop that is to get the children and youth the proper supports that they need. And it goes beyond that. It's not just about children and youth. It's about all the adults. It's all society. It doesn't matter what age you are, but you need to get that proper support. And we have been able to do that, and I'm very grateful for that. And the reason we do that is because the community supports our organization, so we can support the community back.
And you guys both bring up the holistic idea of the idea that Glenn was taken care of with Glenn, and you guys, yes, COVID, were kind of pushed out. What are we doing at hospice? Like, what if I bring my child and we're grieving and it's complicated, and you're working with my child? Are you also going to work with me?
Yes.
Do I also get care? And then how is hospice looking at us as a whole? Because I just want to ask about your sons. Like, how are they? Like, are you guys a whole again? Did hospice provide that? Are we doing that in the community, whereas it sounds like the medical system was closed doors, you're out?
Well,
Make
Lisa,
sense?
I think, has an experience with that. With hospice.
Both my sons eventually had counseling.
Okay.
And I was so relieved, because a lot of my grief and anxiety after Glenn committed suicide was worry about my kids. I was so worried, and I had to get through that. I had to work through that with my counselor before I could even start dealing with my own stuff. So knowing that they were getting counseling, and my counselor was very good at saying, okay, I know you're really worried about this one particular son. I can tell you he's doing okay. So just hearing that was such a relief, because boys don't really talk too much about how they're doing, how they're feeling. That was always a struggle for me. And they are both doing much, much better. And I am so grateful, and I am so thankful that we have, as a community and my family, you know, for my experience, that we have hospice, that we have those programs, that we have the counseling that I could never have afforded the counseling for that amount of time.
Of course.
Honestly. I know how much counseling costs, because we were paying for Glenn for counseling. And that was one of his stressors, was finances. So it was difficult to get him to go. So if we do not have that safety net as a community, I'm really fearful of how many more people would fall through the cracks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then it is very, very important that all our services are at no cost to our clients. That part, plus we see ourselves as the leaders in grief. Because our counselors work directly, it's about grief rather than a general kind of practice. And we really focus on ensuring that we're staying on top of everything that's happening, especially like when COVID happened and we started to shift to the more traumatic side of things is where we really had to get all of our, make sure we did a lot of research, a lot of extra training, all of those things to make sure that we were at such a high level to provide the quality of care.
I think that the nonprofit model with your board of directors at hospice is also so good for this because you're paying attention. I really think that we've had to pay attention to what is going on. I speak to parents at my daughter's school. She goes to elementary school here. And so many of them are talking about mental health and confusion and not having the right words for it. And there's nothing in town for them that is, they're not eligible for anything unless somebody's passed away, and it's too expensive. So I think that's an important piece.
I'm really glad to see that they're starting to incorporate grief as under the mental health funding model, and they're starting to recognize that that's a big part of things, because if you're not getting the support you need after such a traumatic, heartbreaking loss, any loss is heartbreaking, then you start to medicate yourself, and then you start going, in different directions.
A much more isolated approach, which is not the key here at all. Yeah. Okay.
I think hospice's ability to be flexible and like you say, understand what's happening in the community is in stark contrast with a lot of mental health right now. And I understand that our healthcare system is in crisis in general, but mental health, I have to tell you, mental health is much, much worse than healthcare in general. So I'm not surprised that we have all the societal issues that we have around homelessness and opioid crisis and all of those things, because I don't think we're addressing the mental health piece of it. And I think hospice is doing a fantastic job. They're impactful in what they do. The funding stays in this community, and it is for the community members. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about funding. Just tell us a little bit about the annual campaign and what's going on for hospice in Campbell River this year.
Sure. I think just to paint the picture of our funding, we get very little government funding. So we rely heavily on donations in the community, corporate support. We do have our second to none thrift store that helps a bit. And a few odd grants, but the majority comes down to fundraising. And we do have our annual campaign coming. It starts on December 1st and runs throughout the holiday season. And it's our largest fundraiser each year. And it goes directly, like Lisa said, it goes directly to our programs and services and helps us to evolve and meet the needs in the community, which is one of them is the children's grief program that we're looking at developing. So it's really, this campaign is really important to the organization.
Yeah, and I know important for people to understand the full breadth and depth of what we're looking at with mental health. So we've just got a few minutes left. I would love to hear from you, Lisa. What would you like to say to the community about hospice and approaching hospice or donating to hospice?
I think it is really important. I think yes, donate to hospice. I think their programs, their counselors are fantastic, professional, caring, compassionate. I'm right now doing a couple of programs there, and I can't say enough good things about them. They fill a void that is really needed, and it's money. You can be guaranteed that money is going to go to really impactful, important counseling and programs.
Yes, you can. Thank you for saying that. That's so true, and that's so you, Louise. That is what you're doing there, so thank you for that. And then I think we'll just sort of wrap up with a call to action. I know you've spoken already a little bit about the annual campaign, but what do you hope this year with hospice? What do you hope that the community recognizes more? Like what What's your dream?
Well, I hope that the community recognizes, yes, that we are doing very well and we are making a good impact on the community, and we want to continue. So we know that there's a lot of struggles with the mental health, and even with getting your regular GP is difficult right now. Everything is a struggle right now. And we just want to make sure that we continue to be a strong organization. And not only that, but the biggest piece too is our youth and our children. And we need to be able to have a robust program to help them through what's happening. And so through this campaign, it's just going to help us continue with that.
Yeah, wonderful. That's great. Thank you both for being here today and talking about this incredibly important topic. Yeah.
And thank you, Janine,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
your
Thank you.
volunteering and the work that you do in the community. We appreciate that too.
Of course, and I've been looking forward to sitting with you and hearing your story. I've read a little bit about it, but I really appreciate you just taking the time
Thank you.
to share. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you guys listening, and we're here to learn more about mental health and what hospice offers in Campbell River.